Hello, and thank you so much for tuning in to Town Meeting TV. My name is Emily Brewer. I am CCTV's Marketing and Outreach Coordinator. And today I'm joined by Kati Gallagher and Kathy Beyer, who we're going to have a conversation about the Vermont Natural Resources Council and as well as the organization Evernorth and their work to support VNRC's work in terms of Act 181 and the Resilient Communities campaign. So I'm very happy to have you join us here in the studio. And with that being said, I'd love to just hear a little bit from both of you about who you are and what you do in your respective roles. We'll start with Kati.
Okay, thanks so much for having us. So I direct the Sustainable Communities program with the Vermont Natural Resources Council. VNRC is a statewide nonprofit advocacy organization. We focus on different topics related to natural resource protection as well as climate and energy topics. And my program of Sustainable Communities focuses more on our built environment. So where do we want to grow and where do we not want to grow, and the impacts that those choices have on our environment and on our communities. So I work a lot on housing and transportation and infrastructure issues, and that's how I get to work with Kathy a lot, and I'm excited to be here to talk about it.
Thank you. And Kathy.
Hi, I'm Kathy Beyer. I'm Senior Vice President for Real Estate Development at Evernorth, and we build and invest in affordable, mostly rental housing, actually in the 3 northern New England states, so Maine, New Hampshire, and in Vermont. In Vermont right now, we have about 350 units under construction, and we always work with what we call our local partners, so some like Champlain Housing Trust when we're in Champlain County and Chittenden County. We center our work really with smart growth principles, and you will see that most of our housing developments are located in either downtowns or village centers because I always say where we build our housing is as important to conservation as conservation efforts themselves.
Sure. Yeah. And would you like to describe, either of you, just a little bit more about the connection between VNRC and Evernorth?
Sure. Well, I'd say that we, as Kathy just mentioned, the Sustainable Communities program at VNRC very much operates on a smart growth principles framework as well. And so when I'm talking about housing and how we should develop our communities, it's just as much an environmental issue and a climate solution as it is about providing homes for our community members. And so it's really important that we are also understanding the issue of housing as it's understood by the folks who are doing this work on the ground. And so it's been really helpful to have a partner at Evernorth to really inform our understanding of housing needs and what's possible, what's more challenging for housing, where it can be located, what are the major cost drivers and issues like that, so that we know when we're going and having policy discussions with legislators or with partners that we are have the best information to inform our understanding.
Sure.
And I often say we need to bring forth solutions to the housing crisis and the climate change crisis at the same time. And often our interests align. For example, working in downtowns or building in downtowns, there's this amazing statistic about people living in our downtowns drive something like 30% less than the average Vermonter. So just by building in our downtowns, we are also addressing climate change.
Fascinating, yeah. And so you can't talk about housing and growth without mentioning Act 250, and so that has encompassed a lot of your work over the last couple of years, at least in my understanding. And so, for those who might not be super familiar with what Act 250 is, could you maybe give a brief overview on what it is? And then let's jump into Act 181 and your work in creating and implementing that
law.
What would you call that? Law.
A law. Yeah. thankfully it did become law. Yeah, so Act 250 is Vermont's foundational land use review and development law. It's primarily thought of as an environmental review process, but it also considers different community impacts. So these are things like the impact of a development on water quality, or transportation, or schools, exactly. So it's both environment and community. And the way that Act 250 has worked, and I should say that it was established in the 70s because Vermont was in this place of going from a very, very rural, even more rural state than we are today, to one that now has an interstate highway. And so it brought a lot more people and development, and there was a sense that it was becoming kind of uncontrolled. And so Act 250 was put into place, and other states around the country were doing similar work around this time as well, to again, have that review on the most significant developments that were being put into place. Fast forward a couple of decades, and I think that what has been understood is that Act 250 has been really successful in many ways in kind of bringing forward the Vermont that we know and love today. And at the same time, it was built at a time that we are no longer in. And so we are facing a housing crisis like we were not facing at that time. We were facing a climate crisis, et cetera. So there's been discussions for many years about how do we modernize Act 250 to better fit Vermont today. And one of those places, which we'll get to in the conversation around Act 181, but is where does it make sense for Act 250 to apply, where we really want to make sure that we have those protections, and where might we not need Act 250, and a lot of that has to do with, again, the kind of smart growth development and giving credit and understanding that towns now have more sophisticated regulations on their own and might not need statewide review.
That's a good point. So tell us a little bit about what Act 181 is, how it came about, maybe what the process was like to get it passed and enacted into law. I mean, it's not getting anything passed in the legislature it's not an easy feat.
No,
so.
And this one was particularly tricky.
Yeah.
Many people have spent many more years than I have on trying to get this work done. And really what was exciting about Act 181 is that it helped to align Vermont's planning framework from the state to the regional to the local level, which unfortunately has not really been the case. Part of Act 250 when it was passed was that it was this regulatory review process, but it also was supposed to point back to a map that helped to guide those questions of where do we want to grow, where shouldn't we grow, what do we need to protect. And that map essentially didn't come to fruition. It was kind of quickly put to the side. And people have been struggling to get that back to the forefront ever since. And so part of what Act 181 did is that it said, okay, we have Act 250, we're going to update that so that instead of it being triggered based on the size of a project, which was largely
10 units of housing.
Yes, largely how it was before. So think about 10 units of housing in a downtown versus a large commercial development in the middle of a forest, say, just as an example. One of those is going to have much more significant impact on the environment and on our community than the other. And so so the update to Act 250, part of the update was to say, instead of this trigger, which in some cases is essentially arbitrary for what the actual impacts will be, let's look at the locational context of that development. So if you are in a downtown of a place that has zoning, they have their own local regulations, they have water and wastewater infrastructure, they're planning for transportation services. we should be able to build 20 units of housing and not have to go through Act 250. Whereas in an area of the state that has critical natural resources that have statewide significance, maybe we should think about the threshold for Act 250 there and make sure that it's being covered. And if it might not necessarily be through Act 250, maybe it's another environmental permit process, but we need to make sure that Act 250 is right-sized for both where we want to grow and where we don't. So finding that balance, as you can imagine, was very difficult. So again, this was many years of people trying to work together to figure out how that balance could really be achieved. How do we support housing and growth where we want it? And how do we protect our rural and our working lands and our natural resources? And I think it was really the housing crisis as a result of COVID that kind of pushed us over the edge to say, we really need to get this done. And so we're bringing together that Act 250 modernization with updates to our what are known as the regional future land use maps. So these are driven by our regional planning commissions.
Okay.
They are the kind of intermediary between the state and our towns. They're working with the towns to say, here's the area that we want to build more housing. We have new housing targets that the towns are going to have to try to accommodate. And so they might say, okay, well, in this area we have infrastructure already set up. It makes sense. This is where our services are in our schools over here. We have a health center. So we want to reduce Act 250 regulation in these areas.
Okay.
Then that also ties in, and there's no short way to explain this.
It's incredibly complicated.
The third major part is that it also ties into what's known as the state designation program. And so this program designates town areas to provide incentives for revitalization and for housing in certain circumstances. And so, again, just trying to tie all of these different pieces together so that we're really both planning for growth and environmental protection better, but also providing financial benefits and resources for towns to get on the path towards more planning and capacity for themselves as well. What would you add to that?
Yeah, I mean, at the core for a real estate developer, whether you're private or nonprofit, we now are going to know you didn't use the word tiers, but essentially what's called Tier 1A will be exempt from Act 250. And it's a strong statement. This is where we want you to build. And that, a real estate developer will be like, oh, okay. It's going to be easier to build here. The community has actually made a statement. Right. This is where we want you to build. So I'm really excited about it. I think it has. It's a journey we've been on, and we finally found a way to implement it. Yeah.
Which is, it's incredible. I mean, just from you explaining it just now. I mean, there's so many moving parts and pieces, so many people involved. I mean, like you said, from the state level to the local planning commission. I mean, everybody kind of has to be on board when it comes to this, and that's not easy. So, I'm curious. So this became law in 2024. We're almost 2 years later, probably closer to one when you think of when it actually happened. But you mentioned the tiers, but what has happened since, and what is the kind of roadmap going forward with this work?
Well, we have interim exemptions that are quite meaningful for housing. I can't enumerate exactly what they are, but the old jurisdictional trigger for housing for Act 250 was 10 units, and whether you were in Burlington or you were in a very rural town.
Sure.
So there are now interim exemptions that I think go up to 50 units or more, around
50 or more.
50, where during this interim period, your housing project will be exempt from Act 250. And then when the maps are finalized with these tiers, then we'll move to that, which is 2027, I think. It's actually not that far away.
Yes. So the maps will be finalized, kind of phased in. So the different regional planning commissions have been part of what's been going on since the law was passed is that they've been working. The regional planning commissions have been working with their member towns, both to update their regional plans and these associated maps. And then those maps will end up going to what's called the Land Use Review Board. So this is the body that manages Act 250. It was formerly known as the Natural Resource Board. As part of Act 181, they professionalized that board, made the board new full-time staff. A lot of them have planning expertise or land use backgrounds. And so they will actually be looking at those maps and ensuring that they are compliant with the law and the goals of smart growth, as is actually laid out in Vermont law, that we should be following smart growth principles. So they've been working on phasing those in so that the Land Use Review Board has time to review each of those maps. So Chittenden County, Rutland Regional Planning Commission, and Northwest Planning Commission have all submitted their maps now to the Land Use Review Board, and then they will continue to do so over the next year or so.
So that's a statewide board then. They're going to review all of the maps from throughout the state. Okay. So I'm curious to know a little bit more about smart growth and smart development. That's come up a couple of times. So let's go a little deeper into what that actually looks like in terms of this work, and maybe some examples of that actually being implemented in the community.
I have so many examples of smart growth that I love, and what it really comes down to is when we build this housing, their homes, residents are living in their homes. And usually that if we follow smart growth principles, it really does mean it's a more walkable community. It's a community because we've provided, I love this term, that's kind of like, the public spaces, you've provided a place where people actually might congregate, like community gardens.
Run into each other.
And one of my favorite examples is actually in downtown Montpelier, where it's called Taylor Street Apartments. The first floor is the transportation center, and then the 30 apartments are built on the second, third, and fourth floor, and it's beautiful. And it is 2 blocks from the State House, 2 blocks from the post office, probably a quarter mile from the grocery store, and when we do that, it's not only good for our residents who will be living there, it's obviously also good for the vibrancy of downtown Montpelier.
Sure, absolutely.
I think that's a really great example of what smart growth looks like on the ground.
Yeah.
From a wonkier point of view that I can provide, the kind of big picture of what smart growth is trying to achieve is really what Act 181 was meant to do is, again, this balance between how and where we want to develop and how and where we want to protect working lands and natural resources, and recognizing that there is a multitude of benefits, as Kathy was mentioning, for developing in our town centers from not only an environmental perspective, but from a social and an economic point of view. Just to talk a little bit about the economic development side of things as well, smart growth is a concept that's been around for a couple decades now, and it really has been a core economic development strategy for a lot of communities, because when you have more sidewalks and more walkable centers, and you have people who are on their way to the health center, and they can stop into the bookstore next door. That is proven to increase visibility and access to those local shops. And so it's a really great way to boost those downtowns. In Vermont, it's also really critical for our the vitality of our historic town centers and ensuring that we kind of have the resources to invest in our historic buildings that need a lot of love and ultimately financial contribution to keep them around. And so what we've been able to do here in Vermont is make those targeted investments because we have this framework that we've been following. And sometimes it's able to be turned into beautiful housing and with tall ceilings and trim. Sometimes we're turning that into other uses, but it's allowed Vermont's rural communities to continue to thrive, even though we aren't in the same place as we were when they were developed. We have very different industries, we have very different populations, so it's allowing them to stay in place. And at the same time, by guiding our development in those areas, we're able to protect that agricultural land that's surrounding us and make sure that we can support our farmers, and in turn they're providing us with food security. We are reducing the fragmentation of our intact forests and other natural resources that are really important, especially now as we start to talk about climate change. And so, Kathy, I don't know if you want to talk about Taylor Street again, because one of the things that we've been talking about with our partners more recently is the challenge of the fact that a lot of our communities in Vermont were built along rivers, and now they're getting flooded all the time. And so what do we do about that? Right. And so from a smart growth framework, how do we say we want to develop in our town centers, but we also want people to be safe?
Sure.
So that's an ongoing conversation that we're having. But the Taylor Street development is a really fantastic example of how we can address that.
Yeah, so just about every downtown has their center is in the 100-year floodplain.
Yeah.
And rightly so. We in most communities now have flood hazard mitigation regulations about how, if you are going to build in the floodplain, the things you need to do so that it will be safe to be there. And in the case of Taylor Street, we were able to raise what's called the finished floor elevation. So where you enter the building and the elevator lobby is built 1 foot above the 100-year floodplain.
Okay.
And in fact, in 2023, when we had the worst flooding in Montpelier, Taylor Street, the floodwaters did not come into the lobby, but every surrounding building was flooded. So there are ways to build, but you need to pay attention to how they're built. We are also working in downtown Barrie now for a new construction building, and again, it will be built according to these flood hazard regulations, and it will be 2 feet above the 100-year floodplain, so making it even safer. And we don't put any apartments on the first floor because that would be at risk. So there are things you can do to make it safe. Yeah.
Well, and it's really interesting to hear you say that, because I mean the floods were devastating. Yeah. I mean, and it is. I mean, you look on a map, and all these rural towns, and not even, I mean, Montpelier, but like they're right along the river, which makes sense historically. So it's really great that the smart growth takes that into account with these new developments, because I mean, what's the point if you build you're trying to house people, but then 6 months later they're out of a house again. So
there's another great interaction with climate solutions, in that if you're going to build in like at Taylor Street or the building in Barrie, we're not going to use fossil fuels to heat the building, partly because it's good for climate change, but also you don't want to have a fuel tank in an area that's going to flood, because we know what happens to those fuel tanks.
Yes.
So we won't have any fossil fuel tanks to worry about if there is an event of a flood.
There's so much that goes into this work, and I think it's really important to have you guys on and talking about it at this level, because I think, general members of the public that aren't entrenched in this work, it can be really easy to be like, SMART goal, like what is that? Like then when you say what it actually is, it's like, oh my gosh, that makes so much sense. And like, of course we need to modernize this 70-year law. 50-year law. I'm getting ahead of myself here. 1970s, that's why.
Yeah.
So I do want to make sure that we have some time to discuss the Resilient Communities campaign that VNRC has been working on. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about what that project is and why you guys created that?
Yeah. So the Resilient Communities campaign is really focused on what we were just talking about, that idea of trying to make our land use laws and policies and ideas less abstract and more concrete, and make people understand that whether you care about housing or economic development or forest protection, that the way that we address and use our land matters for all of those things.
Sure.
And it's not some, kind of far off governmental regulation thing. It's our ability to live in our communities. It's our ability to have farm fresh food, to have clean water. And so we wanted to launch this campaign to tell those stories of not only what it means for people on the ground, but how we were able to get here. As we talked about earlier, there's been years and years of people working together to try to figure out this really delicate balance for how we use our land, how we address all of these priorities that we have for good reason, and new challenges that are coming forward. And so we wanted to kind of pull back the curtain a little bit and showcase those voices, and demystify the process a little bit. And as we talked about a little bit earlier as well, this is the law was passed in 2024. We're a year and a half out. It's going to continue for, the kind of initial phase will still be another year or two out, but it's all about planning for our communities, and really that is an iterative, ongoing process. Absolutely. And so, as you mentioned, this is ultimately a bottom-up community planning process. And so if we are going to have communities that are reflective of our community's needs and values, then we need community members to be involved, whether or not they are land use experts or involved in these policies. Hopefully they're not involved in these policies. We just need everybody to be aware that there are decisions that are being made today about how their community is going to look in the future, and hopefully provide them with the resources and the education to participate in those conversations and provide their input.
So how can people get involved and, either tell their story or learn more or support your work?
So we have a lot of resources on VNRC's website, vnrc.org. We're adding more kind of every day and trying to figure out for ourselves still, how do we communicate this in a way that's not so terribly policy heavy and wonky. But I would also say certainly feel free to reach out to anybody on our staff, and we'd be happy to talk through things. Reaching out to your regional planning commission is also a really great way to figure out more, especially about those the planning and mapping processes. One thing I will say also is that there's other components of the Act 181 updates that we didn't really touch on that are more related to our rural lands and conservation. And those processes are also still kind of open and ongoing. There's several studies that are happening. There are reports that are coming out. I know that I've heard concerns about certain pieces of those, and so I'd also just say that there's a lot going on, and so again, our website has a lot of information. There are several others, but the RPC, your Regional Planning Commission, is a fantastic resource to get involved.
Amazing. Anything you'd like to add in terms of that, Kathy?
No, I think it's good. Yeah.
Okay. I would love to finish up with this last question. Just, what's one thing you hope somebody watching this interview might feel more informed about after watching this conversation?
I've been doing this work for a long time, and I actually am very optimistic about how many communities are now saying we want housing built here. In response to the housing crisis,
Yeah.
but and then when a community says that, they also says, well, where do we want that housing built? So I'm very optimistic about the conversation that is happening actually statewide, and I hope that continues.
That's great.
I would say my background is in planning and community development, and we are facing a moment of really significant social change, economic, there's environmental, there's so many things that are happening, a lot of scary things that are happening. And what is amazing about Vermont is that we are small. And so we have a lot of power and ability to make a change in our communities, but also at the State House, we have a lot of access. I know it feels sometimes like people aren't listening and things are crazy, but we live in a really special place, and I think that I hope that people in Vermont, especially younger folks, see that access and that opportunity to get involved. Again, especially at the local level, we need people desperately. Vermont relies on volunteers, but also recognizing, when Kathy's saying that there's, hope that people are saying yes to housing, it's important to remember that oftentimes the no voices are much louder, and they're the ones that show up.
Yes.
And so if you are someone who wants more housing in your community, or you want to, protect a certain tract of land or whatever it is that you care about, to go say yes to something is just as, if not more important than if you're against something. Yeah. But recognize that there's going to be other people there who are on the other side. And so having you being supportive of something that's going on at your select board or city council or whatever it is crucially important.
Absolutely. I think that's a really important note to end this very informative conversation on. And I really appreciate you both taking the time to come in and inform our community about this really, really impactful work that you both are doing. So thank you, Katie, and thank you, Kathy. And
thank you.
Thank you so much for tuning in to Town Meeting TV. We'll catch you next time.